We're not doing this because it's fun, we're doing this because we have no choice, and we're doing this because we're all heading towards an apocalypse.
It's dangerous to ignore the scientific evidence because we cannot afford to be wrong on the file relative to climate change.
Why are they doing that? What science do they really understand?
Earth has existed for 4.5 billion years, and it's always changed. But never like this.
Before we get into it, here's a little bit about me. My name is Noah, and I live in Kitchener, Ontario, but I'm from the Seychelles Islands, which is over 14,000 kilometers away. Due to its geography, the Seychelles is at great risk from climate change. Small things like coastal infrastructure all the way up to the entire economy of the country can be affected by the rising sea levels. Due to the imminent threat to people's daily lives, you will struggle to find anyone who denies that climate change is real and is as a result of human activity. However, in Canada, according to a recent poll by Abacus Data, nearly 30% of Canadians don't believe human activity has an impact on the climate. In order to understand the reasons behind the denials, we first need to understand what climate change is exactly. Here is Dr. Blair Feltmate, the head of the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation. Dr. Feltmate's job is to help Canadians prepare for the effects of climate change.
Climate change is effectively a change in the weather as per the expression of extreme weather events seen in the form of flood, drought, hail, wind, snow load. That's the manifestation of climate change that we're dealing with today in Canada.
Now, the world is virtually unanimous when it comes to the existence of climate change. However, the debate is around the cause.
We've gone from about 285 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere now up to about, in 2019, to about 410 parts per million. With more CO2 concentrated in the atmosphere, we trap a greater percentage of outgoing radiation that would otherwise pass into space. The CO2 concentration in the atmosphere holds that energy in the system, and it causes warming. And with warmer temperatures, we get a change in the dynamic of the weather.
Dr. Feltmate is part of 97% of scientists that say human activity is to blame for climate change. But who are the other 3% that deny this? Dr. Ian Clark works at the University of Ottawa and considers himself to be a climate skeptic.
My view is that climate does change and it's natural. By and large, we can change climate on a local scale with deforestation, reservoirs, and things like that, but those are very local scale. But on a global scale, I think that climate is driven by natural processes and not by atmospheric CO2 concentrations.
But why exactly is it that only 70% of the general population believes it's as a result of human activities?
Many people do not believe that climate change is human-induced because it's almost beyond human scope or human logic to think that we can actually change the weather, that our change to the chemistry of the atmosphere can actually manifest itself in the form of a change in weather because the magnitude of the impact seems so great, it almost seems impossible. It seems counterintuitive, which personally I agree with, except the reality of the situation is that with 7.7 billion people on the planet, all of whom are consuming electricity or energy at different rates, we are seeing as a result of that and extra loading of CO2 in the atmosphere, it is nonetheless the reality that climate change is occurring and that it's human-induced.
So what exactly is the role that the media has to play in all this? Well, the vast majority of mainstream media sources all agree that climate change is as a result of human activity. However, there are some outlier groups who suggest that climate change is part of a natural cycle or is caused by solar activity, though the motives of these outlier groups can sometimes be questionable. For instance, the Globe and Mail reported that one of these groups, Friends of Science, had received hefty donations from the oil industry. But what beliefs do these outlier groups hold?
Polar bears have never been as healthy except for hunting up north as they are now. There's no documented evidence that shrinking coastal sea ice has impacted polar bears at all that I've read, and I've read some scientific reports on that.
But are they really doing fine? A 2017 study on the effects of climate change on two separate subpopulations of polar bears concluded that both the populations are spending longer portions of the year in lower quality habitats with reduced access to prey. When it comes to ignoring the facts set out by 97% of the scientific community, is it skepticism or is it just plain ignorance?
It's dangerous to ignore the scientific evidence because we cannot afford to be wrong on the file relative to climate change. We have to prepare with almost a no regrets attitude. We have to put the mechanisms in place to do two things. One is slow down the rate of climate change, and two, adapt to climate change and adapt rapidly. Because the consequences of not adapting, or that we will have excessive floods in some areas, wipe out infrastructure. Other areas of drought, we will not be able to sustain populations. Sea level rise along borders will make it such that we can't live along the coastlines that people are dependent on, because that's where infrastructure is developed. We have permafrost loss in the north, particularly northern Canada, that's affecting the structural integrity of buildings and runways for airports and so forth. We have to prepare for the changes that not only are occurring today, but they're going to get more challenging going forward. And for people to deny that human activity is the force behind this change in extreme weather that we're seeing will have a deleterious impact on our economy and our society that we cannot afford to sustain.
When we talk about climate change denial in Canada, it is important to address the fact that Canada has the third largest oil shares in the world. This means that a very large number of people's livelihoods depend on the fossil fuel industry in Canada, and therefore, if climate change is blamed on fossil fuels, many people will begin to divest from it, causing thousands to lose their jobs. So to them, it is convenient to deny.
Yet I've yet to read science that demonstrates that we are in a period of extreme weather that is unusual. We have extreme events, extreme rainfall, extreme flooding, extreme heat, forest fires, and when you start to parse it out, what's responsible for this or for that, it's not very clear that it's because we have increased atmospheric CO2 with our emissions. I think that we have to be very careful in where we attribute these extreme events to.
So it's not to say that human activity through the burning of fossil fuels is the only thing that could cause changes in the climate. On a geological scale, there's changes in the Earth orbit, Earth wobble, solar activity, volcanic activity. A number of things can cause changes in the climate. But over the course of the last 100 years, which is really what we're focusing on, the only mechanism that explains this particular change is the burning of fossil fuels. And there's very, very good agreement on that within the context of the scientific community.
What do young people have to say on the matter, though? After all, they are going to inherit the Earth someday. Mia Bayer is a student activist who protests nearly every week on Parliament Hill to demand that the Canadian government take more action against climate change.
In some way, I guess you could justify it, but the science is there. The science is real, and we do make an impact. And it is not just us, but we are the major ones. We are the ones who contribute to climate change the most. And it's our recent actions that have only started happening in the past few decades that are really changing the climate.
I think it's imperative that young people, like yourselves, discuss facts and don't go marching in the street unless you know, unless you've read the science and you've examined all points of view and look behind. Look, okay, this guy's saying this. Why is he saying that? Why is he such a climate warming promoter, advocate? Oh, is he being paid by, has he got a political agenda? What's going on? I think you guys have to be objective and thoughtful.
So we have to be very, very careful that Canadians, that most of whom live in southern Canada, don't even think about the consequences of climate change and how it's affecting people in the north, because we don't live there. But we're really taking populations that are very disenfranchised to start with and putting an extra burden of stress on them when they can barely survive with the stresses they have. So anybody who thinks climate change is not problematic to people in the north, they should go and talk to First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and they will get a healthy dose very rapidly of just how problematic this situation is.
It sometimes is hopeless and it's hard, and we're not doing this because it's fun. We're doing this because we have no choice, and we're doing this because we're all heading towards an apocalypse, and we're all heading towards extinction, and that is utterly terrifying for someone who is not even 18. And I want people to know that if you believe that climate change is real and you want to take action, you are supported by by people around the world. And you are not alone in this fight, and we will win. And this isn't a hopeless fight.
Many of the arguments brought in by deniers are in some way valid, but they do not take all the factors into consideration. It is valid to say that there are many other driving forces behind climate change, but it is clear that human activity is the primary cause.
But whatever it is you believe in, I'm sure we'll all agree, it's worth protecting.